at this point. So again, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. This is our first seminar of our 2021-2022 Gilbrea Annual Seminar Series. As we do every year, this is a series that creates opportunities for the exchange of ideas and stimulates discussion amongst researchers and graduate and undergraduate students, community members, and older adults. And this year, our seminars will be exploring the theme, critical explorations of care in an aging society. We are thrilled to have Dr. Kim Lopez here with us today to kick off this series with a seminar on gender-racialized laboring bodies in long-term care homes in a time of woke. I'm sure you're all accustomed to this by now, but we will ask that you keep yourselves on mute during the presentation to avoid background noise. Kim will present for about 40-45 minutes, and we're going to leave the last bit of our allocated time for a question and answer period after that. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any point during the presentation, and we can read those on your behalf during the question and answer session. Or you can, during that question and answer, unmute yourself to directly ask him those questions. So I'll start off with a quick intro for Dr. Lopez, who works as an assistant professor in the Department of Rec and Leisure Studies at the University of Waterloo. And Kim is critically examining structures that produce and reproduce oppressions affecting experiences of aging, of long-term care labor, leisure, and well-being. And in particular, Kim values working collaboratively to amplify individuals who identify with justice-deserving groups. To do this, she looks to influencers of anti-racist feminisms, anti-colonial and restorative practices, and identity-informed literature and art to hear knowings that are held in bodies that labor to care. So welcome, Kim. Please join me in virtually, but very warmly welcoming Dr. Kim Lopez.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Meredith, and thank you to the folks at the Gilbrea Center for Studies in Aging, Nicole, Equity, Rebecca, Meredith, thank you for organizing this meeting. I'm so happy to be here with all of you here today, and as Meredith said, my name is Kim, and I'm from the University of Waterloo, Faculty of Health. And I'll be sharing some thoughts about laboring care persons, essentialized to be women of color, who I'll refer to as women of color from here on out, who are employed in long-term care homes during this age of awakening. And as I was preparing my slide deck, I referred back to my abstract that used the word awakening 3 times, on which one hand reminded me of how much attention I needed to bring to these awakenings, but also just made me wonder just how awakened I was when I was preparing this description for you all. But I appreciate that you're bearing with me through my terrible scripted joke, in effort to open this session with a light heart as we buckle in to engage in some less light work, perhaps. So we'll begin with a brief history of woke and what staying woke meant for Black folks and what it has evolved to in its present use today. And that will lead us to an understanding of awakening to the pandemics of both COVID-19 and systemic racism, which deepened precarity for people engaged in long-term care labor in a climate of scarcity and isolation. Next, we'll touch on care from away with a cute reference to the Canadian come from away, but with a sentiment of here to stay for labor and what that means for bodies of color employed as care persons during broader sensitizations to systemic racism. Lastly, I'll offer some insights on the perceptions of worth of gender-racialized bodies engaged in caring labors and what we can all do to support labor assumed by burden care workers. And it's my hope, oh, that's a little bit off the slide, but it says, I hope to end with some cautions and sensitizing questions to kick off some discussion. While I feel that each of these topics can be written into a full course, I feel this presentation can provide at the very least some Coles notes in each of these areas. And the topics that you see on the screen, they do feed into each other, but are not linear in any way in their progression, but rather they make up a connected assemblage of forces, structures, and relations that shine a light on persisting conditions and lacking response to the need of staff of color in long-term care homes. Before we begin, I'd like to take a few moments to acknowledge the land and the caretakers of this land, both past and present. I'm a second-generation Canadian settler of colonized Philippine ancestry. And as occupant of this territory, I hope we can together pay homage to the land and the peoples deserving of truths, including the acknowledgement that meetings of learning like this one is a settler privilege. While we gather virtually, I acknowledge the unsurrendered and unceded land that continues to be contested, on which are places of learning, rest, care, leisure, and employment, and other practices of living were established and prematurely taken away from many Indigenous people. The university for which I work, the University of Waterloo, including Kitchener and Cambridge campuses, is located on the Haldimand Tract, unceded land promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and its traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And since regional amalgamation, Scarborough, the lands on which I live and am sharing with you today, were designated part of Toronto. Selena Mills and Sarah Rock write that Toronto in itself is a word that originates from the Mohawk word Takaranto, meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, which is said to refer to the wooden stakes that were used as fishing weirs in the narrows of the local river systems by the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat. The Toronto Purchase Treaty was one of many environmentally and culturally exploitative land agreements made across Turtle Island, in which all so-called agreements were in fact in the best interest of settlers. For Scarborough specifically, this land is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, including the Inuit and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Pictured here is the Rouge River, considered part of the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, a portage route of the Holland River, linking Lake Ontario to Lake Simcoe. As all of us here know, caring is a political act of solidarity and of community making, and caring is what enables future generations and connections to our ancestry. And it is all of our responsibility to take care for this land and our fellow humans and non-humans in seeking difficult truths and facilitating reconciliation and solidarity with First Peoples. Stay woke. According to Richardson and Ragland, Black language comes out of the Black experience. This language is rooted in the Black oral tradition of tonal semantics, narrativizing, signification signifying, the dozens playing the dozens, Afro-American syntax, and other communicative practices. Geneva Smitherman says, the Black experience is the narrative of resistance and of an ongoing struggle to be free. Richard and Ragland say, quote, the phrase means to remain aware of what is going on around you and in society. More specifically, to remain politically aware or conscious. It just doesn't mean now or today. It means stay woke all the time. The Black word woke, and referring specifically to a political consciousness type of being awake, is an excellent example of how Black people developed language by imbuing it in it with concepts needing to be expressed efficiently in one word, end quote. Geneva Smitherman, Introduction to Ebonics. Tahama Lopez Banyasi and Candace Watts-Smith, authors of Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, write, we know who the overt racists are. They belong to white supremacist groups. They use the N-word. Structural racists are the Supreme Court justices who have concurred with the decisions to dismantle the Voting Rights Act. They are the educators who punish Black students more harshly than white students for the same offenses. They are politicians who disparage whole groups to gain the support of people who are racially resentful. But who are complicit racists? They are those who do nothing, who go along. They enable the perpetuation of white supremacy. They adopt the logic of colorblindness, that since race shouldn't matter, it doesn't matter. But staying woke means vigilance, speaking out, and using one's privilege to undermine racism, end quote. The sentiment of stay woke pervades the music of contemporary Black culture. A few examples include Erykah Badu in Master's Teacher, who sings, "Even though you go through struggle and strife, to keep a healthy life, I stay woke." And Childish Gambino in Redbone, who drops, "Now you don't close your eyes, but stay woke." And Meek Mill's Stay Woke lyrics here that I will play for you now.
Sometimes I wonder how I keep from going in. We scream Black Lives Matter, but we still towing ladders. Watching our own brothers trying to get at us. Dreams get shattered when I'm scene full of crackers and they try to do some shit you ain't do. I'm like, what happened? We go get lawyers, say shit we don't know how to talk. They told us to hate each other before we learn how to talk. Fight, push it, right. He kiss you night, monsters under the bed. Every night feel like a fright night, coke fumes in the air. Mama holding on that pipe tight and you catch a contact, but never mind that. In a world where black is wrong is white, right? It's like a combat. We go to war for our freedom. They say we equal. I used to want to play like Randy and be an eagle. I used to play the quarterback. My dog would go receive me. That was to the ball, got flat by a dope needle on the pavement. It's amazing, this environment we was raised in. On them papers, no mistake, and I'm getting caged in. You gotta feel me. Feel like the system trying to kill me. Got arrested in the charges I won. For popping with the same.
Sorry if the audio wasn't, it was less than ideal there, but you're welcome to listen to his song Stay Woke, to listen more deeply into the lyrics of the rest of the song. It's a good one. It is said that the quote, it is said that the quote, "Wake up Ethiopia, wake up Africa, let us work towards one glorious end of a free, redeemed, mighty nation. Let Africa be a bright star among the constellation of nations," by Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican political activist, publisher, journalist, entrepreneur, and orator in 1923, was one of the first documented references to the expression of awakeness or being woke. A watchword carried throughout history and used by Black communities to signal to wary others living in Black bodies that they should remain alert for their lives. In a Vox article, Asia Romana writes about William Melvin Kelly, a Black novelist who reintroduced the term woke into mainstream in his first-person piece for the New York Times called "If You're Woke, You Dig It" in 1962. In that article, he writes how Black culture and vernacular becomes appropriated into the white mainstream, where we see woke Olympians, yes, that's a thing, who take up being woke into the limelight. See Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey dodge comments on his hashtag Stay Woke Heather Gray t-shirt. Exhibit B is this sweater wet weather mug accompaniment that places being woke on a punny, too woke to go back to sheep mug. Given the gravity of the history, registering as woke should carry with it a mindful pause at the very least, particularly by those unafflicted by what the phrase cautions people living in Black bodies against. Pandemics. Pandemics, yes, plural. I just learned actually less than an hour ago from my colleague, Dr. Burberry, the word syndemic, syndemic conditions, meaning multiple interacting and mutually aggravating epidemics themselves worsened by already existing negative determinants of health. And in this case, due to COVID-19, by Waldron, Herring, and Young, 2006. Without the pause caused by one, that of COVID-19, the other, that of systemic racism, did not have air to breathe, to put those of us in lockdown on notice of what was being ignored on the regular. Resistances and organized protests took place, people became ill, lost loved ones, care workers burnt out. Sports stopped, emergency protocols were put into place, acknowledgements were crafted, book clubs were struck. People reflected on how to speak, when to speak, what to speak. It caused us to reckon with self and take stock of the current state of race relations, or in Canada's case, the lack of race articulations. The International Epidemiology Association dictionary defines a pandemic as an epidemic or a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease occurring worldwide over a very wide area, crossing international boundaries and usually affecting a large number of people. While I won't argue whether disease can be constituted as sociopolitical sensibilities and practices that place judgment on one's being or occlude one's social mobility, I will argue that these forces, whether microbiological or socio-oppressive, are both virulent and infectious. I won't review the heavy heart events of 2020 and 2021 with any depth here, but I will draw attention to the key learnings from the broader awakenings to COVID-19 and systemic racism. In my opinion, these are just two of the many ongoing pandemics, including that of climate change denial, lack of truth towards reconciliation, state-sanctioned eviction, state-sanctioned genocide, mental health, censorship, exploitative labor, misinformation, and others. I personally saw COVID-19 unfold during mid-2020 from a very interesting perspective, and Meredith knows this about me. I became a mom in July 2020. Please take note of my pure joy as on my face as I labored with a mask. It was obviously worthwhile because of this tiny human. But in seriousness, COVID-19 was so front of mind for me that even though I knew the hospital was the safest place for me, I felt I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I was keenly aware that staff were doing the best they could to flex and flow with the changing protocols. And to compensate, I felt I became annoying in my expressions of gratitude to the labor and delivery staff. Despite all their best efforts to do their jobs and keep everyone around them safe, I was still quite overwhelmed with angst and concern about the world we brought him into. In a postpartum, well, let's call it a flow of consciousness, I thought, how do we care for this little baby apart from our communities? How do we maintain connections while keeping him safe? What if COVID were to affect my then 76-year-old mother who was living with us at the time? How does this part Filipino child maintain any sense of the culture of which he descended if something were to happen to her? I found it difficult to put two thoughts together, let alone make sense of the world during this very sensitive time. And I'm sure many of you have shared feelings when there was little known about COVID-19 and few viable options forward at that time. Fast forward to present day, we've unfortunately lost approximately 4.9 million people due to COVID-19, according to Johns Hopkins University. While a grim milestone, at the very least, we know the numbers, and the numbers help to contextualize the stories of loss. There is less to be said about racial data anywhere, but particularly absent from Canada's healthcare landscape. And as a result, there's less to be said about people affected by racisms, but I'll speak to that in a few slides. We can have community organizers start visual installations documenting the befallen, like Save Rename. But regarding the pandemic of systemic racism more broadly, so little is known globally. Globally about how many have succumbed to complications, or better yet, entanglements of racial capitalism, genocide, hueism, eugenics, caste politics, private health, the legal system, education, among other forces of premature BIPOC death. In 2020, it felt like a broad proclamation of anti-racism had been made, or at least some recognition to the harms against BIPOC people. This recognition, along with the acknowledgement that the long-term care home system was in grave need of repair, created the conditions for active resistance on both fronts simultaneously. Awakenings to intersectional precarity, to synergies of oppression, to genderacialization. I took up this word genderacialization during some of my graduate work with the acknowledgement that the language that we take up to describe bodies of difference is limited, but simultaneously needed, while the gender and race in genderacialization is useful in locating a position, The position itself becomes useless when we consider that position to be ever-changing, contextually local, and intentionally difference-making towards essentialization, if you catch my drift. So I refer to structures that gender and racialize with the acknowledgement that it is embedded in much greater forces working to oppress, like capitalism, colonialism, neoliberalism, and include class and other axes of identity. We're awakening to the class nature of PSW labor, reproductive labor that's structured in poverty, in which people who work as PSWs or healthcare aides or personal care workers are described in the literature as less skilled and moreover less respected than those who are providing care in more acute settings. Under living wage employment is a marker of a great proportion of PSW labor. Then there are the awakenings to the confusing pathways to PSW training for work in long-term care homes. This is a politic that reveals the many ways individuals navigate confusing systems for one to demonstrate proficiency in PSW work in a long-term care home. Awakenings to how undervalued care workers are in making invisible BIPOC women who are overrepresented in frontline care work, revealing the systemic undervaluing of healthcare work and the visible overrepresentation of racialized women who work as PSWs in the labor of care compared to other professions. Awakenings to the interplay of ageism and long-term care home work, specifically how ageism contributes to the stigmatized nature of care and long-term care homes, rendering PSW care less visible in the healthcare sector. Awakenings to care worker stress, scapegoating, and COVID-19, drawing our attention to how poor care is largely a factor of stressed material conditions, a lack of accountability, a high turnover, and caused by poor working conditions, with many of the staff being the focus of the blame. With previous calls to action being met with an underwhelming response to stress and burnout, further pronouncing the invisibility of this precarious work prior to COVID-19, let alone during COVID-19. Awakenings to the invisibility of leisure and welfare and self-care. Considering the impact stratification has on PSW care labor and its subsequent effect on time outside of work, it renders dedicated self-care leisure time out of reach for individuals caught in these complex structures. Awakenings to divisions in care labor resulting in transnationalization of less desirable or cheap care work, which speaks to the systemic inequality within structures that maintain transnationalization of care work, where divisions of care labor are not only distinguished by privileged nation states, so countries where care work is required so one can be freed up to pursue higher valued labor, but part of the larger gender-racialized systems that dictate socioeconomic privilege. In 2018, I completed this dissertation that addressed 8 politics of care, which many of we've addressed today, but little did I know how the events of 2020 would amplify these messages, so many others, and I have spoken regarding these synergies of oppression. The care work that was is made up of emotional labor, physical labor, work that is feminized, racialized, and classed. It wasn't that long ago, really, when race and care work and long-term care were mentioned in the same sentence that people in the room would look down or avert their gaze. Since I've spoken with lots of other folks who are doing work in this area, and they've said, now that people are listening with attentive ears, eyes, and hearts, we struggle to keep up with the work that's needed, which is good, but also calls attention to how many others across all sectors of interest in care work, like aging, long-term care, women's studies, age humanities, body work, labor studies, equity studies, public health, health policy, employment law, and other areas are needed to address the widening gaps in systems that claim to care for all, but don't. Care from away. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the story on which the popular musical Come From Away is based, here's my telling of it in like 20 seconds. On 9/11, 38 international flights were grounded in the small but mighty town of Gander, Newfoundland. 7,000 travelers and 19 animals landed on in the small town, were cared for, fed, and provided emergency accommodations by the people of Gander, which numbered at the time just under 10,000. The way this community pulled together in this time of crisis was truly a lesson for us all. The musical reflects the kindness and warmth shown by Newfoundlanders, a quality that many citizens of this land reflect onto the world, such as the tropified nice Canadian. This is a not so great segue that highlights how we, people from so-called Canada, like to be seen in a moment of hardship versus how we've come to accept the long-term care home status quo and accept people from away to deal with the hardship in long-term care homes. We'll now move into a discussion of how difference made through immigrating care laborers and persons of color are in long-term care homes. So this will be the second time that I mention my mom in this presentation, mostly because she's a badass who fuels my interest in care and these topics. And I'll mention her one more time, and I'm pretty sure after this she'll joke about why she wasn't mentioned a fourth time. But in any case, this is her outfit of the day photo. And in this photo, she's also recovering from her third knee surgery. She retired from nursing work at the age of 72, just 5 years ago. I grew to recognize that many women many women feel that they care because they just have to, and often have few choices around matters of care. I am the sole child of immigrants from the Philippines. My mother, or Ma, as I call her, was the eldest of 3 children. She left her home, first in a rural part of the Philippines, to Manila, to work in the Netherlands as a healthcare aide. Multiple moves were necessary for her, either for education or work, to tap into sustainable earning potential for her and herself and her family, a trend that's maintained today. Every month, she would send a portion of her income to her family and set aside a little for herself. As she neared the end of her contract, she applied to immigrate to Canada, and she landed in Canada on August 28, 1976, and moved in with a girlfriend who immigrated a year before. The day after she landed, she traveled to a long-term care home to fill out an application for work as a care aide. And following an interview the very next day, my mother was hired, earning $2.65 an hour, which was minimum wage at the time. Life in Canada is perceived as better for work than the societies in which women who immigrate are born. Instead, individuals migrate to societies where there is a need to renegotiate gender-racialized identities and to align with the reproductive employment, with many of these roles being in care positions. Female migrant workers from countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, significantly outnumbered men who enter into care roles as nannies, private care, or domestic care support workers, where the focus tends to be on of migration tends to be on caring work. Many individuals, mostly women, come as participants in the caregiver program or temporary foreign worker program with aims to end up in formal care and long-term care homes or the hospital or community settings. Rachel Paninas, a professor at sociology at gender studies in the University of Southern California, writes extensively about the implications of leaving a home country to engage in caring or domestic labor abroad. She specifically cites Filipinas in describing an international transfer of caretaking, which is a 3-tier transfer of caregiving responsibilities between social classes. She describes how working women in wealthy countries hire Filipinas for low-wage care, who in turn hire even lower-wage Filipinas in the Philippines to care for families that have been left behind, who are often too poor to migrate. Filipinas in her study described the pain of family separation, these feelings of loss, guilt, and loneliness, displaced mothering or displaced caretaking, so caring for somebody as if they were caring for a member of the family that was left behind, and conflicting class mobility, so a lower status worker in what she calls a Western country with higher pay versus a high status worker in the Philippines with lower pay, as some of the experiences of transnational work. Though women from the Philippines are only one group of transnational workers, Filipinas are highly visible in the role of elder care around the world. International class and social equities are perpetuated in transnational caring work. In Canada, research is currently being done through the Center of Global Policy, Gender, Migration, and Work of Care to address some of these issues faced by women in their migrations for work. Until more recently, women of color engaged in reproductive labor continue to be silenced, largely due to what's called a depoliticizing of difference, according to Flores, in a multicultural society. Healthcare in Canada aligns with and operates with the tradition and is further legitimized by ideologies, institutional practices that branch from dominant systems of belief. Douglas describes this institutionalization of inequity as the naturalization of social classifications. And invisibility results from a lack of supports available to support such transitions, with few international skills recognized in the immigration of labor experiences, marginalizing individuals through the maintenance of insecurity in employment from a lack of seniority. Systemic inequity, which privileges one group of persons over another on the basis of assumed consensus of rights or abilities of favored group or class, is perpetuated by a number of reasons. Blindness to institutional discrimination in Canadian systems of care, the need to cheaply supplement current care resources to support an aging population, and a neoliberal illusion that long-term care can provide the secure employment opportunities that one seeks as a new Canadian settler. Of individuals who care from away, Pyle says they face wide-ranging problems that affect their mental and physical health, eroding their well-being. They work often and live in environments that diminish their opportunities for a healthful existence. In short, the level of care they experience in their own lives is seriously deficient. They continue what women migrating for care labor experience, and the actions they take in response are complex and shaped by many dimensions of social reality, including particular economic, legal, political, social, and cultural conditions of the receiving countries. Prinas found that Filipino domestic workers in different contexts of Los Angeles and Rome experience similar problems: painful separation from their families, reduced occupational status, and alienation and social exclusion from host communities, including quasi-citizenship. Of color. What does it mean to be of color? It's an ontological question, one that we don't have time to dig into here, but we can begin to consider the ways, again, the language of marginality, difference, and oppression change and are taken up. I promise this will be the last mention of my mom in this presentation, but I did ask her what it means to be a person of color, and this is what she said. Ma, are you a person of color? Of color? No, what do you mean? It's no, right? Is no the right answer? If someone were to call you a person of color, you would say, well, if that's true, okay, I think I'm Asian. Or is that true? Filipino? I think I would say we're all the same, you know, but I think it confuses me. While this is anecdotal, I think it illustrates a point I might get to making about how being of color is a bit of a language game that places emphasis on identity politics and maybe a red herring that takes away from the overall move towards liberation. This may be an unpopular opinion, but I think that asking whether you do or you do not belong to this equity deserving group brings up a lot for BIPOC folks who have not considered that their identity languaged in this way. We've already talked about how Canadians have a very strange relationship with race, and I can't tell you how many times that I've asked people to clarify or identify with a race, and instead they tell me their nationality or ethnicity. And this is totally a function of the system for race to exist and have an effect without explicitly existing. It becomes increasingly more complicated when you pose the argument that everyone is racialized, but some peoples are affected and targeted by racisms differently. For many new Canadian settlers, there sometimes is a need to feel protected by sameness, a need to not be identified as different. Many see safety in sameness. Perhaps racial groupings for many were too political, either in their home country, and until recently, it was seldom taken up by folks who immigrated to Canada in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. To come into the awakening of others into race can complicate one's identity that for some folks has already been reckoned and made peace with. It's not to say that this shouldn't or can't be critiqued. It simply means that identifying of color is a positioning that some may not have previously identified with. And to further, as it pertains to long-term care, may not feel the desire or need to take on or identify with ongoing of color anti-racism work, but I'll come back to this in a minute. Worth. The culmination of all of these topics becomes, how much are laboring bodies worth? To us as a society, to capitalism as a commodity, to kin as family, to older adults as facilitators of life and living. I took these words used to describe PSWs from long-term care home reports and news articles, and the dissonance of this collection of words is interesting to reflect on. And it makes me wonder just how much of the long-term care system that failed so many older adults during COVID-19 benefited from essential heroes that formed the backbone that carried the system away from what could have been an even more dreadful situation, as difficult as it might be to imagine. It's the same pandemics that usurped individual agency and other power to reduce care workers to their laboring bodies. Labor. According to Glenn, work activities maintained racial divisions within feminized forms of labor. Activities like, she says, as caring for the elderly in old age homes, preparing food for restaurants and fast food stands, and providing emotional support like counseling have all been brought into the cash nexus. From the abstract of this talk that overemphasized oh so many awakenings, I restate that in a precarious line of work that sees overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color, these awakenings have only amplified the amount of emotional labor needing to be done by people in long-term care, PSWs, and other care workers in an already fractured system. PSW labor is all of practices in this new world constituted through COVID-19 and the racialization of care work. Staffing shortages, labor, lockdowns, labor, vaccine refusals, protests, labor, outbreaks, labor, and of course, profound illness, death, and loss, labor. As we work together to address systemic racism in all places, including long-term care homes for staff faced with these intersectional precarities or synergies of oppression, consider what the greater long-term care home sector has awakened to, and what woke people have lived for generations. Consider what of color means to think through to what exists beyond color, to outward to reckon with white fragility, supremacy, diversion, guilt, denial. Beyond of color to consider race with other intersections of identity. Beyond of color, inward to subjectivity and embodiment, to consider how does one embody their experience of racialization with other presentations of self? Experiences of racialization that are held in the body, sometimes not able to be articulated due to trauma, violence, etc. This embodiment of experience, the pre-verbal, the ineffable, the unarticulated, the corporal should be valued too. Beyond of color to emphasize racial formation and racial projects. If we make the issues about the system and the politics connected to the system, then we can sensitize ourselves to the issues to get behind them and act for change, regardless of your social skin. And finally, how individuals language racialization differently. It's a call to do equity labor equitably. In long-term care homes, individuals are recovering from COVID-19, yet are spaces where conversations of racial equity and change are needed. People of color need to restore them or ourselves through conversations on anti-racism and not be depleted by them. I invite you to share the labor or mind your own labor in doing so. And while the Health Standards Organization and the Long-Term Care Service Standards Technical Committee under the leadership of Dr. Sinha are making strides in the areas of equity for residents, and we hope soon too, in staff in the near future, I encourage all of us in attendance to continue to advocate for the following work that works to support the redress of both COVID-19 and systemic racism experienced by staff in long-term care homes. In your capacity, how might you advocate for the following? Collection of race-based PSW data, reporting protocol for race and gender-based violence, a PSW registry, paid sick days, living wages, ending for-profit healthcare, long-term care, quiet and restorative spaces for staff, opportunities for shared decision-making, regional Indigenous support for long-term care homes for staff and residents, and relational care approaches that shift away from solely person-centered care to consider all of those in the caring experience. Who might hear your message and act towards change? Thanks so much for your time and attention and your energy today. And thanks again for the Gil Brea Center for Aging Studies for hosting me.
Wow, thank you so much, Kim. I think what a thoughtful and gorgeous talk and sharing of your ideas. I wish I could, amplify and capture my clap to kind of resound with the applause that I know is echoing kind of in our virtual sphere here. And I think what a fantastic and thought-provoking. I'm really a lot to munch on as we kick off our critical explorations of care seminar series. Thank you so much. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions. I'd invite you to, if you're comfortable, jot your question, query, thought in the chat box, or you feel free to use the raise hand function, which is located in the reactions tab, which is that smiling fellow in the Zoom tab. Yvonne, I saw your hand was raised. Did you have a question, Yvonne?
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Ah, okay. I kick us off with maybe a question, but I think it's maybe a large question, but and bear with me as I try to articulate what I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about your word awakenings, which is kind of run through as a thread of your talk, Kim. And I've been thinking about it in particular in relation to kind of care theory and kind of the canon readings in care theory really continue to hold, I would say, gender, maybe class, as kind of central tenets, and that's what are kind of held to in feminist critique. And I've been wondering as you've been sharing the experiences from different participants or from the studies that you've been carrying forward over time, how do we make space for the entanglements and kind of those intersectional precarities that you've highlighted in care theory? How do we introduce that into that, what we might consider the core bodies of care theory? That's a really big question. I was thinking, I think in your PhD work, you were doing body mapping and maybe some more kind of participatory, engaged types methods. And I wondered if that was a way to begin to, I don't know, use of different kinds of methods to change and move theory. I guess it's a big question. I've just been thinking about awakenings in constellation or in conversation with theory, and specifically care theory.
Yeah, and I think theory is always and already happening, in conversations with individuals who are experiencing what labor is, and adopting the socio-political positions they've assumed throughout their identities. And for me, in engaging in this work, it just feels like people just need an opportunity to restore themselves, because we're running on autopilot all the time because of what's happening. And I don't think people have had a moment to even catch their breath, really, and think about this. So, coming into a space and dropping these very large questions about the feminization of care, the class of the, how care is classed individuals and how it reproduces the various inequities that we're all kind of interrogating in our everyday work, that it's all too much. And I think just by supporting people in breathing through and kind of unpacking their experiences, I think says it all, and all that we need to know. And it really just reverberates all of the things that are taken up in care theory by people and practitioners who have lived those experiences themselves. I think they're great echoes of each other. And, while we take up and use specific language to articulate care theory and interrogate care, that that language is reflected in people's everyday practices and the lack of care for self and the lack of response to that care for self. And the system relies on that, right? The system requires people to push off on those tasks and attending to that type of care for self because it's so needed for everybody else in this moment. As I said, I've been on mat leave for a little while and things have changed a lot since before I went. And I still feel that's a sentiment, but has only been amplified or, expanded in such a way that people just need more and more space today.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thanks for engaging with my slightly formed question there. Any other questions, ruminations that you'd like to share with Kim, pose of Kim? Thanks to Bonnie for a very positive comment in the chat box. Thank you so much for this powerful framing and evocative presentation. Completely.
I have a question.
Great, thanks, Lisbeth.
Mostly just because I can't stand silence. Kim, thank you so much. Wonderful as always. I guess my question is, if we think a lot about liberatory work right now, and particularly in the term woke and these types of languagings of some of these movements, so often it's borrowing from Black, Indigenous, peoples of colors, from cultural movements that hopefully intend to have people of color at the forefront. And yet, I guess my question is, thinking about Barad's notion of responsibility as our ability to respond, I'm wondering how you would address an audience of many different racialized peoples, whether it be racialized of color and or potential whiteness, to think about the responsibility and whose responsibility and how to put forward responsibility in organizations around making some actual structural changes towards, more useful spaces and places for all peoples.
Thanks for that question. Wow, what a complicated question. I feel like if we had good answers for that we'd enact some of those things right now, because it's been a bit of a dance, hasn't it been? I know that for myself, I rushed from mat leave to the spaces where I could enact voice, or I could put in practice change, where I felt my capacity, I had a capacity and influence. But was that the right response? Or should I have had just really sat back and, supported other people in doing that work? Or is my support in that space not useful at all? And is it really the responsibility of others to act instead of me? I really don't have a good answer for that. I think rest is really crucial to this moment for people who are laboring in different ways. And rest is how we kind of reconstitute ourselves and our ability to engage in these types of resistances. So I think it's a really kind of iterative process for people who feel that, yes, when they need to and want to and feel energized to take up those types of charges, that they can and have space to do so, but also recognizing that, you know, there are so many different people who are in different positions on these types of topics right now. And I am not able, and others shouldn't feel responsible to have to move the needle or fight for what is deserving, what they deserve. So again, I don't have a good response, but I think that it's up to individuals to negotiate that and create coalitions and communities of solidarity so that they can share in collective restoration as they prepare to continue to resist in whatever capacity they have available to them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisbeth, and thanks, Kim. We have a question in the chat from Crystal Jade that I'll read out. And it really builds, I think, quite actually nicely from a previous conversation that you just had about rest. So Crystal Jade asks, speaking to your statement on creating spaces of respite within long-term care for care workers, what might this look like? And then a follow-up question, are ideas or spaces of respite in tension with current conditions in long-term care?
Yeah, hi, Crystal Jade, by the way. Thanks for your question. This suggestion actually came from a PSW who talked about how she was engaged in an disagreement with a family member, and what she wanted to do was go out into the hallway and scream and just kind of like release all of these, emotions that she was having, but she couldn't do that in that space. She couldn't go to the nurse's station. There were things that were happening there. There was no room in the staff people because people were having, other conversations and stuff stored. It was just not a space for her to decompress in any meaningful way. But I don't mean just space as a physical space, but also time as a time for space or space as time as well. Because when it becomes about this notion of bed and body care that Gubrim promotes, we have no space to process, create relationships. It becomes simply bed and body work. And that is, dehumanizes the entire process for everybody, and really takes people out of that relationship. So when I'm thinking about respite for care workers, it is the physical space to decompress from all the challenges and difficulties that are associated with care work, but also the time and space to engage in care outside of work because of all the wonderful supports that the system now provides for people in an ideal world engaged in care labor, but also time to be restored through their relationship and connection and communion with others, including their coworkers, family members who come to visit and support, volunteers, and also the residents that they work with. So space can look very differently depending on what's needed for any given person. But I think all of those mentions for space are valid and should be taken into consideration.
Thanks, Kim. We might have time maybe for one or two more questions if any burning questions remain. Just scanning all of the boxes. A last call. If there are no other questions at this time, Kim, I imagine you have your email address up here on the slide. Oh, Gavin, did you have a question? I see you turned on your video. Okay, I was just, I was paying attention here. Kim has generously put her email address up on the slide here. So I imagine if maybe questions arise as we continue to percolate all that's been shared with us today, we can reach out to Kim as well. And Kim, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time and your work and your care with us in this presentation today. Thank you so much. And if everyone could join me in another round of virtual applauses, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you and this community of practice that you're setting up. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for attending this seminar series.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Meredith. Thank you, Equity.